And we are live. Happy Dream Day. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It is an absolute honor to introduce this live stream, Woke or Still Dreaming, a dialogue on King's I Have a Dream speech, social justice ideology, and the future of liberalism on the anniversary of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's groundbreaking speech. This event is co-sponsored by the Institute for Liberal Values, Braver Angels, and Free Black Thought. And I speak for all of us when I say that we gather here today in the spirit and commitment to viewpoint diversity and free discourse. To quote the Journal of Free Black Thought, who published the original correspondence centered on the Dream Coalition letter between Andrew Gutmann and John Wood Jr., we come together in the conviction that freedom has a million authors, but no single authoritative source. We seek here to model the fearless, pluralistic, good faith sharing of ideas. In this discussion, we bring Andrew Gutmann, co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values and the original visionary behind the Dream Coalition letter, John Wood Jr., an ambassador for Braver Angels, and Erec Smith, professor of rhetoric at York College and the founder of Free Black Thought and the Journal of Free Black Thought that published Andrew and John's correspondence. Also on the panel is Harry Boyte, a lifelong civil rights advocate and former field secretary for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference headed by Martin Luther King. Kenny Xu, author of An Inconvenient Minority and founder of Color Us United, and writer, artist, and the king of star manning, Angel Eduardo. I'm Jennifer Richmond, founder of Truth in Between, host of the Hold My Drink podcast, and co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values. I'll be moderating this conversation along with David Bernstein, executive director of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values and the co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values. And so with no further ado, I hand the mic to David to get us started. David, take us away.
Thanks so much, Jen. It's really a privilege to be able to moderate this discussion with such a high-level panel and to really model the liberal idea, which is free expression, but also learning to agree and disagree in ways that are productive. I want to start off with Erec Smith, the founder of Free Black Thought. And Erec, why don't you talk a little bit about Free Black Thought, sponsorship of this conversation, and what some of the interesting ideas and tensions that have come to the surface?
Well, Jen pretty much said everything I was going to say. So I'll just start off by talking about the main impetus of Free Black Thought. The co-founders, I'm just one of the group of founders for Free Black Thought. We thought Black people were being seen as a monolith in America, if not Western civilization. So we wanted to, remedy that by presenting a compendium of diverse thinkers within the Black community. I don't even like saying community. There's several communities within Black America, right? But also to create a journal of Free Black Thought. And that's where we published the letter and the email correspondence between John Wood and Andrew Gutmann. We did that because we wanted to be transparent in our appreciation of viewpoint diversity. We're very serious about that. We also feel like people need to start modeling mature adult conversations about touchy subjects, right? And we think it's our duty to give people a platform to do that. So that's why we're here. That's why I'm here. And I'm happy to be a part of this.
Great. So speaking of touchy subjects, why don't we get into it? Andrew, please talk about the letter, what inspired it, and what your take on it was, why you think it speaks to the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah, well, let me first echo what Jen and Erec very eloquently said, which is I'm really proud to be part of a discussion like this. I think discussion and debates like this is something that is, very rare in today's very polarized world, social media world. So to be able to have these kind of difficult and kind of anything around sort of the issues of race is sort of a difficult discussion. But there are so many topics today that are so difficult to discuss. And I've said this in so many interviews. Democracy, we see in the media all the time, democracy is about how many people vote. It really isn't. It's really about, can we as citizens have discussions and debates on difficult issues? So again, as my beginning of this, I really like to say I'm very proud to be a part of something like this. I'll talk a little bit about, I think, sort of the genesis of this idea of the Dream Coalition, the genesis of this letter, which really started when I I sent a letter to the parents of my daughter's New York City private school back in April that very unexpectedly went viral on what is now known as sort of the issues of critical race theory. It wasn't really called critical race theory back then, and started to have a lot of conversations, had a lot of people reach out to me about what is going on in our schools and more broadly in our society, and how do we fix some of these issues? What are these issues? These sort of this illiberalness that we're seeing, this obsession with race that has sort of taken over our schools and our workplaces and even our government and military, and really generally in our society. Cancel culture, this really attack on free speech and free discussion. And so how do we start to fix this? Because I think a lot of us were really surprised by how quickly this had taken over our schools, how quickly a lot of these ideologies had taken over our country. And I started to think and talk to people about that and said, well, there's a lot of things I think we need to do. But one of the things that I think, and obviously I'm not the only one that thinks this, that we need to do is this has to be a national movement. And it has to be a nonpartisan national movement. And one of the very disappointing things that I've seen in sort of the 4 months that I've been involved in these efforts is how politicized that these issues have become. And it's just sort of the world we live in now with the polarized media and with social media. But it shouldn't be. And issues like free speech and discussion really shouldn't be these polarized issues, but they are. And so how do we make this a national movement? And around what? And around, I think what we need to go back to, which a lot of people say is this, the idea of color blindness, which comes, the most famous part, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, that comes out of the I Have a Dream speech, but more broadly, the classical liberal values that are also under attack by what I think is a small minority of people. Again, the attack on sort of free speech and the cancel culture issues and the meritocracy. And so, I would say we really need sort of national rallies and events. And I was looking for a date around sort of back to school time and realized that, today, August 28th, is the anniversary of Martin Luther King's, very famous, one of the great speeches of American history, really one of the great speeches in human history, the I Have a Dream speech. And, can we rally behind that? And can we put together a coalition, a bipartisan, nonpartisan coalition to really rally behind that? And, everybody sort of knows, the most famous sentence from that, which is judge me by, the content of my character, not by the color of my skin. But the speech is so much more than that. And, King in the speech quotes, the Declaration of Independence. And what it really was, a reaffirmation of the American dream and a reaffirmation of the principles that this country was founded on. But now we need to apply them to all our citizens. We need to apply them to blacks, which obviously until the civil rights movement was not being done. And those are really, I think, the principles that we need to fight for today. Again, it's the color blindness, and that's part of it, but it's also these classical liberal founding principles, equality of opportunity, free speech and free discussion, meritocracy, that I really do believe, and I use somewhat strong words, and I'm sure we'll get into this with regards to the letter, but I really do believe are sort of under attack. And we're in this very, I think, scary path that if we don't start to rally Americans behind this, that we are going on this sort of very, very dark, dangerous path for our country. So the original idea was really to have a day of events and rallies, and we started to plan something, sort of a big rally in Washington, D.C., and unfortunately there just wasn't quite enough time to pull something like that off. We were only trying to do this with 6 weeks of time. But David Bernstein had suggested, let's do a letter and let's try to, put in paper what we are trying to rally behind. So I sort of took a shot at the first draft of that, and it went through, a number of round of edits with a number of people. And there were people on both sides. Some said, this needs to have stronger language. And some said, we should really, tone it down and use, and I'm sure we'll discuss this, and use, more of the language of the civil rights movements. And I see, certainly see both sides. I will say personally, I do think that the challenge, the greatest challenge we have is rallying Americans to join this fight. And I do use the word fight because I do believe this is a fight. Now, some people I know, and I've had these discussions, think that that word is too strong to say it's a fight, but I do really think it is. I think it's a fight for this country, for our children, for their education, for our communities, against this divisiveness. And so, I sort of come out on the side of using a little bit stronger language here, but I thought that everything in the letter, was consistent with the messages in King's I Have a Dream speech. The intent was not necessarily to take his whole body of work in the very same way that, King quotes the Declaration of Independence, not quoting, the whole body of Thomas Jefferson's work. And that was sort of the idea there. And so, we wrote this and went out and got signatures, and, not unexpectedly, it draws controversy, because I think anything on these topics draw controversy. There are, various thoughts on how we do try to fight or not fight, or how we do try to solve some of these issues. So that's, I think, my very long-winded answer to that, sort of the genesis of where this letter and where this Dream Coalition came from.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. By the way, I invite all the viewers who want to ask questions to do so in the comments section. We'll be monitoring that, and we will try to get to some of those questions if we have time. John Wood Jr., you had some misgivings about this particular effort, and if you would talk about that, but as also what you think needs to be done to sort of revisit the dream of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you, Erec. Free Black Thought is a promising and a much needed organ of intellectual input and activity. And I'm just very grateful to be a part of this particular program and to be cheering for FBT's success. Grateful, of course, again, David, for the Institute for Liberal Values. But let me just say, above all, that I am grateful to be able to bear witness to the sincerity of Mr. Gutmann. Andrew reached out to me, responded to an email that I had sent, which I imagine a number of folks listening to us now have read the republished version of, wherein I voiced some concerns and some objection to the letter as it stood, the Dream Coalition letter. And Andrew, rather than responding with any sort of bitterness, really, I think, took the time to seek to deeply engage the points I was making. And this live conversation here is an outgrowth of Andrew's sincere engagement with my perspectives. And so I just want to applaud you, Andrew, and thank you for the spirit with which you've been willing to undertake this discourse. I want to communicate something, and by the way, thank you for being long-winded, Andrew, because hopefully that gives me a little bit of leeway to be as long-winded as I usually am. I want to say two things up top by way of framing. The first thing is that I am in deep sympathy with Andrew, and I think likely others on the panel and others listening, in feeling that the United States of America is in a moment in time within which our ability, or inability rather, to have difficult and delicate conversations over race, matters relevant to race, has yielded a cultural momentum behind the undermining, the sabotaging, the undoing, if you will, of the sorts of pillars of democratic exchange, including free thought, including intellectual inquiry, including the valuing of viewpoint diversity. And that without these pillars, it is difficult to imagine American democracy progressing in a way that allows for the full and inclusive engagement of each citizen to be a meaningful good in the way we do politics in America, the way we run and govern our communities and our nation. This is something to be deeply concerned about, and I do believe that it is a development that would be deeply concerning to Martin Luther King Jr. And so, insofar as that is the case, I think that the letter is right to establish some connection, or at least to perceive some connection between the values that King stood for and the values that folks like Andrew and others in this group, and I would count myself among that number, are seeking to defend in the context of seeking to preserve the liberal foundations of American democratic society. Having said that, part of understanding my opposition to the letter has to be taken in the context of a larger trend of American society with respect to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. That's something I've been vocal about for some time and is a problem of both the left and the right, I would argue, and has the potential of being a problem of, let's say the center, if you will, although probably not fair to characterize everybody in this panel as being centrist, of course, but just by way of simplification. That is the fact that on the left, for some time, there has been an effort to portray Martin Luther King Jr. as misunderstood by mainstream American society because he was, in fact, a leftist radical. He was a person who had aggressive views about economic redistribution, a person many of whose policies would run in perhaps a social democratic direction, and that Dr. King was more militant than people remember him as having been, and more willing to be confrontational. And if you doubt that, just look at the hard language he used in parts of the letter from a Birmingham jail, for instance. I will hear sometimes members of Dr. King's own families giving speeches to audiences that may largely be composed of Black Lives Matter activists and folks who represent more of the current mainstream of social justice activism. And it's great that these conversations are taking place. But what I frequently detect in these addresses is a tendency to sort of pick and cherry pick and sort through individual words, phrases, verses from King's speeches to sort of push a square peg into a round hole to get it to line up more evenly with what it is people want to feel in the current moment within the social justice mainstream, which I think is some justification in the idea that a more straightforward, combative approach to shutting down our opponents is necessary and acceptable to the goal of developing a more equal and equitable society. And that if Dr. King had only lived long enough, maybe he would have agreed by this point, and maybe he was even tipping in that direction by the time that he died. This is the sort of mythology around King that I have seen sort of protected and amplified in parts of the left. And then on parts of the right, you have a parallel development. I ran for Congress in 2014. I ran as a Republican in Los Angeles. And it was an interesting time for me to run with the message that I was bringing because it brought me into contact with Republicans and conservatives who were in the middle of experiencing a renaissance of sorts in their understanding of Martin Luther King Jr. At that moment in time, Martin Luther King was being upheld as, in fact, having been a Black Republican, in fact, having been a Black conservative. Now, the origin of this perception is, in fact, a misperception. And at this point, I think most people have caught up to that. But I think that this began with a well-meaning misunderstanding from another member of Dr. King's family, in this case, Alveda King, who assumed that because Martin Luther King Jr.'s father was a Republican and that because he was a Black Baptist preacher who opposed Southern Democrats, that somehow meant that Dr. King was a Black conservative along the lines of others we could name. And for a while on the right, you had this mythology surrounding King. And look, it was great to see people taking an interest in King's legacy. But on each side, what I have perceived, not just over the last few years, but over the last several decades, almost since the years after I think King was killed, has been an attempt to take aspects of King's legacy, to put them forward in a way that substantiates political perspectives or agendas or social points of view that may overlap with things that King thought in certain areas, but that fail to capture what most needs to be preserved in King's legacy. And that's a commitment to nonviolence and the idea that American society can only realize the American dream if we are able to model a culture of goodwill towards each other that calls upon us directly to love our enemies and to communicate in that way. Now, and so that brings me to the letter. And let me say again, I do not see Andrew Gutmann, and the authors of this letter as operating in a cynical political manner. And I do think some folks, maybe do when it comes to sort of appropriating King's legacy for the purposes of making a political point, if you will. So I want to make that clear. And I also want to make the point too that I do not look at the Dream Coalition letter outside of the framework of King's legacy as representing sort of a lowest common denominator approach to political communication. I actually thought that, judged against the way in which we usually talk about these issues, that the Dream Coalition letter was reaching for a higher standard. But the standard that King holds us to is a standard that has to be understood in its own right. And so King gave a speech in 1961 about the American dream. I think it was I think it was a commencement address, and I forget the university. In the speech, he really does identify the American dream as being the substance of the Declaration of Independence. And so that core truth, I think the letter correctly identifies as being at the heart of, near to the heart of King's understanding of the ultimate promise and potential of the United States of America. After mentioning this, King in that speech makes the point that he does not believe that the American dream can truly be realized without a broader dream, without a greater dream of a world of brotherhood, of peace, and of goodwill. Now, the letter is also, I think, sort of deft, I suppose, in sort of setting the American dream and King's dream alongside each other without, and Andrew in his remarks a moment ago sort of accomplished this a bit too, without necessarily directly conflating the two. Nevertheless, it's important to understand King's dream in its own right here, because in order to accomplish the American dream, King believed that two things fundamentally needed to be accomplished. Well, perhaps more than two things, but I would take two distinct areas of his thought and bring them front and center here for us to consider. On the one hand, the context of the I Have a Dream speech was one in which Dr. King was, of course, advocating for the final realization of first-class citizenship, of equal citizenship for all Americans, but certainly for the African-American community in particular. And part of what we have to remember about King's dream and King's work is that he was not only seeking equal rights before the law, but equal purchase on the prosperity of American society. And so, I know I should be concise here, there is a real way in which I would argue that, particularly given the fact that this letter puts itself in dialogue with the social justice community, which sees itself as acting for some of the same end goals that Dr. King was acting for, a more equitable society where opportunity and access is more reasonably distributed, equitably distributed for people of color in American society, to not name that dimension of overlap and agreement, which I'm sure exists ultimately between well-meaning people from both the social justice left and those of us who are fighting to defend liberal values in American democracy. To not name that seemed to be a moral mistake to me, and something that fell a bit short of adequately representing something that was at the heart of the I Have a Dream speech itself. But the second thing that I make note of in my email that I consider to be even more important is recognizing the fact that Dr. King's dream was of a society motivated by nonviolence, in which love is the guiding principle for our interactions with one another, one that calls upon us to speak to one another in a way to where we affirm our points of agreement and the dignity of our opposition before we go into the space of articulating our disagreements with each other. That's what nonviolence has to say about communication. But beyond that, the idea of the beloved community is that we resurface this sort of spiritual commitment to goodwill between Americans and between human beings in a way that sets the stage for us to truly join hands at the table of brotherhood, in the sort of language and description that he gives to us, that he shares with us in the I Have a Dream speech itself. And without a modeling of nonviolent communication and a naming of nonviolence, or at least the themes that go into nonviolence as being the deeper heart of King's message, it seems to me that with noble intentions and with many accurate things stated, that the letter somewhat tips into this same American tradition of taking aspects of King's legacy that overlap with a certain political program and using that to give strength to that perspective without shining a light on the deeper philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr.'s that this nation so sorely needs in this moment of time. But having said that, we have the opportunity to discuss some of that now and to get some of that on the table. So for that, I'm grateful.
Thank you very much, John. Kenny Shu, love to hear from you.
Well, thank you for having me here, David and John. Thank you for amazing comments. So I'm the president of Colorists United. We advocate for a race-blind society. I really do think this is the essence of Martin Luther King's dream. Having thought about it, examined his work, and also examined his contemporaries. First of all, I know John mentioned that he thought he ran as a congressman, as a Republican, while Martin Luther King was being called a conservative and Republican by other Republicans. Now, of course, there's no evidence to suggest that Martin Luther King was himself a Republican, and I'm not going to try to pine who he voted for. But I do think Martin Luther King was a conservative. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. If you go to the Washington Post's editorial on Martin Luther King Day in 2017, the headline was Martin Luther King, conservative. And what did they mean? Martin Luther King was a true conservative. Well, if I just wanted to read you what the Washington Post editorial board wrote about Martin Luther King, that description of the civil rights leader whose birth we celebrate today might surprise or even offend many of the people coming to town to celebrate the inauguration of a new president and the supposed triumph of conservatism in some form or another. He believed in American exceptionalism, but throughout much of our history, a greater part of it could be found in the kind of biblical message that Dr. King carried to the pulpit and the nation. There's something wrong with our world, something fundamentally and basically wrong, he told a Detroit congregation in 1954. The great problem facing modern man, he said, is that the means by which we live have outdistanced the spiritual ends for which we live. Martin Luther King and his fight was more than just a fight for America. It really was a fight for God's kingdom as he saw it. And what he was trying to do was he was trying to conserve, yes, the principle of nonviolence, but towards what end? To reveal true justice in the midst of depraved human nature. In the midst of depraved human nature. That is a fundamentally conservative belief, that human nature is by nature depraved, and that we are still struggling to achieve true justice. And that's what I believe too. I believe that human nature is depraved, right? And that true justice is difficult to reach because human nature is depraved. But that does not mean that we shouldn't strive for the ideal, right? And the ideal is colorblindness. The ideal is colorblindness. And Martin Luther King Jr., he wrestled with that, not just in his I Have a Dream speech, but if you look at his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that he gave after accepting the Nobel Prize, he said, "I refuse to believe that the starless night of racism I refuse to believe that the starless midnight of racism will continue to divide our country and our constituents and our people." He really did want an end to racism and truly an end to race as a source of division. He understood race to the extent with which race divided people, but he didn't want that to divide people anymore. And that's what I believe as well. So if we're going to harness the principles and true principles of Martin Luther King, we have to understand that he wanted a race-blind world. And by the way, this stands in difference, and this stands in stark contrast to what his contemporaries in the civil rights movement believed. If you look at Malcolm X, who Martin Luther King met once, considered his ideas, and then rejected his ideas. Malcolm X believed in Black power. Malcolm X believed that in the internalization of race for a Black African American independence. He believed in African American Black independence, and he believed that in the end, the races, the white man and the Black man, were doomed to continue to fight with each other, and that the only solution was separation. That was something Malcolm X fully believed, and that was something Martin Luther King considered but then rejected. So there are actually opposing views to race blindness. You could go with Black separatism, you could go with Black independence. There are good points that Malcolm X made, and then there are even points that some of his even more extreme contemporaries, like Stokely Carmichael, made, or Frantz Fanon made, about the need for Black violence. But Martin Luther King rejected all of that. He rejected all of that, and he pointed us towards the true race-blind ideal. So if we stand with Martin Luther King's vision, we actually are standing against other visions of civil rights, like Malcolm X's vision, like Elijah Muhammad's vision, like Stokely Carmichael's vision as well. So we have to understand, and the thing is, I do stand with Martin Luther King, meaning I stand against all of these other visions, and I think that race blindness is the vision that we should conserve.
Thank you, Kenny. Angel Eduardo, love to hear from you.
Oh, well, a lot has already been said. John is as eloquent as ever, and I largely agree with him. I think invoking Martin Luther King is something that should be done with care and a deep level of concern, because it's easy to take these figures that have become mythical and legendary and kind of reduce them to one or two things that jibe with our particular political persuasion or leaning or agenda at the time. And even if the kind of zooming into this one particular aspect negates the rest. Martin Luther King was a full human being with many thoughts and many ideas, and I agree largely with John in wanting to be careful with that and wanting to preserve it. So there's that aspect to it. But for me, there's also just a kind of practical, tactical aspect to it, which is kind of what John touched on about kind of, extending a hand and saying, reaching out and saying, we acknowledge the humanity of the people with whom we are opposed in this endeavor. We disagree with their ideas, but we do not disagree with their humanity, and we welcome them into the fold in a sense. I think it's important to do that, not just for our own sort of I don't know how you would say it, but our own sort of edification in what we're doing, but also for the practical sense of it is better to make allies of our enemies. It is better to attempt to do that than to close the door on that possibility and allow them to be our enemies and allow them to remain our enemies forever. So that is one thing that I think it's very much in my wheelhouse. It's very much what I care about as a communicator and a writer and someone who, star manning is this whole concept that I coined the term for, which is just refusing to dehumanize others, even as you are being dehumanized. And a lot of the inspiration for that comes from the sentiments of Martin Luther King and the things that he espoused, the ideas and ideals that he espoused. So I do think that's very important. And so I'm I still found enough in the letter to agree with, to be comfortable signing it and standing behind it. And in the interim between my signing the letter and reading on the exchange, the interchange between Andrew and John, and seeing both their sides and trying to understand both their points, and also Free Black Thought's ideas on this in general. There are a lot of points to be had. There are a lot of points to parse. There are a lot of things to discuss here. But I just kept going back to the Frederick Douglass quote of, "I will unite with anyone to do right and with no one to do wrong." And I saw in this letter at least the intention to do something that I believe is right. And so I went ahead and signed it anyway. But I do think that wherever possible, wherever we are attempting to stake a claim and make a statement and trying to push our discourse forward, trying to push our situation into a more positive place, it is imperative for us to do what we can to build as many bridges as possible, to keep as many doors open, as many possibilities open for compassion and for understanding and for good faith as we possibly can. And that's a lot of what I hear in what John is saying and what John's misgivings were about the letter. And I fully agree with him on those points for sure.
Thank you, Angel. Harry Boyte, love to hear from you.
Let me be sure I'm unmuted. You can hear, right? Well, thank you. I want to thank the Free Black Thought. It's a promising and important platform. I want to thank John for inviting me to participate. I always appreciate John's insights. And I agree with John. The letter does not reflect Martin Luther King. I know this from personal experience. In 1968, when I was hitchhiking around the country, trying to figure out whether to go to college or be a itinerant poet, I called home and Dad said my father had been manager of the Red Cross and had become active in Atlanta and the South in school desegregation efforts. And in 1963, in the summer, he went on staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as an executive assistant to Dr. King and the only old white guy on the executive committee. And I called home and he said that. He said he'd gone on staff. And I should come back to Washington. They were having a march to get the attention of the nation. So I found a ride to hitchhike back with from California, actually. We drove night and day. We got there. I put my sleeping bag on the floor of Dad's hotel room, and I heard Dr. King practice the speech in the room next door. I have a dream. So that was inspiring. And of course, it took shape over the next several years as I worked for field secretary for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I worked in a particular part of the movement, which is little known but foundational, called the Citizenship Education Program. And we sponsored and worked with 900 grassroots citizen leadership centers across the South, in church basements and beauty parlors and sometimes in community centers and different settings. And that's what I want to just mention. Another dimension. I agree with what John said about the profound commitment to nonviolence, and nonviolence not as a tactic. That's become the fashionable rap about nonviolence today. It's a good tactic to fight injustice. It was a philosophy. It's a living philosophy. And it was also a kind of politics, everyday politics. Karuna Mentana makes this point very well in the new volume of King as a political philosopher to shape a new world. So it had philosophical principles like nonviolence is harder than violence. It takes more discipline. It takes more courage. It takes more boldness. I saw that all the time in the movement. Secondly, that not only is it right, but it's also actually more effective to understand one's enemies than to demonize them or humiliate them. Thirdly, a love of the other, who is a hater, is redemptive. It offers possibilities for transformation. And King was very concerned with the transformation of the person and the self-transformation of the person. All those were part of the philosophy of nonviolence. But there's another dimension that's rarely talked about. I do not agree that Martin Luther King's commitment was to equality understood as mainly opportunity. That's an assumption that people are striving in a highly competitive society, and that what they should be able to do is to make it in that society. Dr. King stood for transformation, but it wasn't a left-wing transformation that aimed at equality of material results. It was a transformation in power and dignity and humanity. And I was at the heart of the citizenship school curriculum that I worked with. And just in 1963, SCLC had taken over the citizenship schools from Highlander in 1961, and because it was a mushrooming movement across the South. There were 40,000 community leaders who came through the Dorchester Center to go back and create citizenship schools. What this equality meant in the citizenship schools was a civic empowerment that was nonviolent and based on dignity, but also based on the sense that it is everyday citizens who are the agents and architects of democracy. It's not politicians, it's not government, they're all necessary, but actually it was the notion that we, the people, made democracy, and we make it better, and we make it realized, and we make it full. So he was retrieving, after the consumerist individualist 50s, an understanding of democracy which was far richer than it had come to be in the 50s. More rooted in the 30s, actually, because his advisors were all in the 30s, and mentors like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. But in this sense, equality was not equal opportunity. It was what Danielle Ellen is getting at in her wonderful book on the Declaration of Independence, our declaration. Allen is a Black philosopher at Harvard, very active in the world. Her reading of the Declaration of Independence concept of equality, and her subtitle is a defense of a reading of the Declaration of Independence in terms of equality. Equality meant everyday people's power and agency and capacity to shape their world together. It was what we call civic agency or civic empowerment. I don't think we can talk about that great speech in the 1963 without understanding that many of the people in the march, the marchers themselves, had been schooled in citizenship schools where that was what they talked about. That's what we talked about. We talked about it all the time. That people have a need to author and to be, we are the ones we've been waiting for. That was Dorothy Cotton's song that described the philosophy of the citizenship schools. A deepening of democracy to mean every relationship was what Septimus Clark, who was the original architect of the citizenships, called their aim. So it was a nonviolent politics which was empowering. And I think too much King is taken out of context. The march itself, it's important to remember, the march organizer was Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was assigned to the march by A. Philip Randolph. Rustin was a brilliant organizer and a mentor of Martin Luther King. He was gay, so he was kept out of sight usually. But Bayard Rustin framed the march as a conversation with Middle America. It was not a protest march. He said that very clearly. The CNN documentary makes that clear, that there was a portion of the country that was for the civil rights movement, a portion that was deeply opposed. Most Americans were vaguely sympathetic. This march was to engage them in terms of their own dreams and hopes for the future. And King's speech was a brilliant articulation of that engagement with the American people. It wasn't simply it wasn't at all a decontextualized speech. It was a particular speech to say, we all are bound together in the search for a more perfect union and a deeper democracy. And the The marchers themselves embodied that spirit. I saw it. It was amazing. As amazing as it was to hear King deliver the speech I had heard him practice the night before. The dignity and the discipline of the marchers, the hundreds of thousands of marchers who came from all across the country, was remarkable to see. And the program notes, and I'll finish with this, expressed the call to the marchers to live up to the message. The program notes wrote, in a neighborhood dispute, there may be stunts, rough words, and hot insults. But when a whole people speaks to its government, the quality of the action and the dialogue need to reflect the worth of the people and the responsibility of the government. That was a call to citizenship, to be bigger, to rise to the better angels of our nature. And I saw that in the march. It was the heart of Dr. King's speech, and it was really the animating spirit of the citizenship schools, which was, as Andrew Young said, the foundation of the whole march, of the whole movement. There would have been no movement without nonviolence and the lived philosophy of the citizenship schools that put it into practice.
Thank you, Harry, for that. So several of you spoke both about the moral dimension and the legacy of Martin Luther King's speech and Martin Luther King himself. And we've also touched upon sort of the strategic dimension here. How is it that we're going to collectively make change? And I would proffer that we are part of a new movement, a new network that's coming alive to try to restore the liberal proposition in American society and Western societies, where we're able to talk about ideas again. We're able to have open conversations like the ones we're having today. And in every advocacy movement I've seen, there's almost always two schools of thought, probably more. But one would be that looked for a compelling, unwavering moral voice that would try to energize the core of a movement. And that tends to be much more uncompromising. And another advocacy school of thought tends to be that which argues that we have to understand who we're trying to move, and it looks for the fence sitters, the people that need to be brought into our camp, and tries to devise language that makes them more sympathetic and understanding. And so I thought I would go back to Andrew and John on that. How do you see that playing out in this engagement around the letter? How do you think we, as a movement that wants to restore liberal conversation in American society, how do you think we should move forward together?
Want me to go?
Andrew.
Sure. Let me address just one quick thing, and I don't want to be defensive about the letter too much, but the issue of nonviolence, which is I didn't really think there was anything at all in the letter, the Dream Coalition letter, that was anything close to violence. I think there was some aggressive language about ideas, but very carefully about ideas and not about, criticizing ideas, not criticizing people. So I would make that distinction, because I think that's, we have to be able to use somewhat strong language to go after the ideas that I think are really, really divisive and damaging to our education system, to our communities, and to our country. I will also know, and this came up in the email exchange that I had with John, that, when appropriate, even in the I Have a Dream speech, King did use some aggressive language. He called the Alabama governor and the other Alabamans vicious racists. He could have used other language. He could have said they were miseducated or misguided. I think I used those two words as examples. So there is some precedent to use somewhat aggressive language, even in that single speech. Now, I don't pretend by any means to have anywhere near the understanding of King or his body of work or scholarship. I don't have that background. So I certainly have a high degree of respect for, the other panelists here who have much greater of an understanding of his legacy. I would, one thing, and then I'm going to get to David's question. One of the things I think is very sad to me, and I hope it is very sad to everybody else, is that, especially in the last year, King is no longer taught in schools. His sort of legacy is being eradicated. This idea of the colorblind society is now viewed as obsolete or archaic or even racist. And I think and this is sort of the broader point I want to make, is sort of the oft-used proverb is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. if we try to hold any usage of, frankly, any historical figure up to perfection, we can't ever use them. And if you expect anybody quoting or writing about any historical figure to be as knowledgeable about their body of work and scholarship as scholars who study them, as their profession, then nobody can write or quote from a historical figure. And I think that's something that, listen, there's got to be some leeway as long as you are in, the intent is good, as long as you're in the spirit. And we can argue whether the letter was in the spirit of the I Have a Dream speech or whether it was in the spirit of, King's broader body of work or beliefs or life. Back to David's question. Listen, I think we are, like I said earlier, I think we are losing this fight, and we are losing it desperately. Now, others can disagree, and I think it's great to say we're going to take the high ground, and I think we should, as much as we can, for those of us that are fighting for these classical liberal principles and for a colorblind society, or against. And this is, I know there was criticism. You said what we're for, and we also said in the letter, what we are against, but against this obsession with race that has sort of become pervasive in every area of society. We've got to defend the principles. And, I've had this discussion a lot in the last few months. Do we, as David said, are we trying to grab and educate the few people to come over to our side? Or are we trying to really get the people who are on our side to stand up and fight and have their voices heard? And again, I've had, these discussions, and people have a differing view. And I have a very strong view of this, which is there are enough people in America on both sides of the political aisle that are in agreement that what is going on in our country is not the right direction, that is divisive. But they are terrified for all the reasons we know of cancel culture, of being called a racist, if you're on the left, of being called a conservative. They are terrified of speaking up. And so when I thought about how to frame, this letter, and frankly, how to frame, any of the arguments that I make when I speak to people, it's more about how do we get people to stand up and fight for these principles than it is about trying to grab a few more people to our side that don't already appreciate what is going on. So again, my view is that we need to mobilize Americans to fight, and that was the idea of this becoming a movement. And so, I am very sympathetic to the argument that some of the language may not have been as consistent with King's I Have a Dream speech, with his broader body of work, with the civil rights movement. I would, beg for leeway in the sense that the intent is we need to save King's legacy. We need to advocate for the colorblind society. I think we need to advocate for those classical liberal principles.
Thank you, Andrew. John Wood Jr.
Yeah, indeed. Well, first of all, let me say I wish we I sort of wish we had 2 hours at this point rather than 1. I know that time is limited. Just sort of quick comment on the letter. I don't think I would have had any objection with respect to the letter if the letter had made a sort of a standalone case against social justice, against the current sorts of excesses of social justice activism, and cited Dr. King as a part of this larger argument, as an example of someone who advocated for social justice, who also understood the importance of freedom of speech and engaging different points of views in good faith and in equal standing. That would have been just fine for me. I think that my issue fundamentally was sort of the centering of the argument in a way that seemed to rest its core strength on the King legacy. For precisely the reason that Andrew just mentioned, which is the fact that King has not been taught in the substance of what he truly believed and stood for, aside from a selective sort of application of components of his perspectives, right? But the fuller picture of what King stood for is not, related to us in society today. And that needs to be the case. And so, hence my sensitivity towards using King's legacy for the purposes of amplifying perspectives that may partially overlap, but in a way that doesn't allow King's whole perspective to sort of come through. But that said, I mean, I do think that Andrew makes sense in saying that, you know, we need to be able to call upon historical figures, not always referencing their whole body of work, but looking at the ways in which certain aspects of a historical figure's perspective may overlap with what it is we're advocating here for. I'm totally fine with that. I just think that we need to be careful in how we do it, because I think that there's a right way to do that, and I think there's a way to do that which can go a little bit too far in taking in seeming to suggest too much in terms of an overlap. But I'll leave that at that. The larger question: how should we be communicating? Well, again, so you know, I consider myself to be a student of nonviolence. You know, I try to study the teachings, the methodologies of Dr. King. I try to learn from people like Harry Boyte, etc. And ultimately, you know, again, King's philosophy of approach was a part of the very substance of his message. King said that we have to achieve peace by means of peace, and that there's a way to do that in communication that has to do with deeply acknowledging what may be legitimate in the perspectives of your opponent, in the perspective of the opposition, affirming his or her human dignity, and then leaning in with the moral arguments. And by the way, this is what people always miss in Letter from a Birmingham Jail when they try to make the case that that somehow is an example of King sort of conveniently, you know, tiptoeing away from nonviolence when it suited him. King was firm and morally fierce in the perspectives that he articulated in the Letter from a Birmingham Jail, but he began that letter by identifying the white moderate clergymen as his brothers, people whose intentions he understood, and recognizing the fact that there was a Christian fellowship that existed between them, which meant that there are things that they could agree on and reasons for him to be able to emphasize their humanity and their dignity. And he, even in that letter, he finds things to point out of value in their perspectives. It doesn't mean that he holds back, right? We can communicate in that way. Martin Luther King Jr. was a friend of Stokely Carmichael's. They were marching together when the Black Power phrase came out of Stokely's followers' mouths and became a big issue in the media. The media tried to use that as an opportunity to show that the movement was breaking down. I mean, you know, Kenny, it won't surprise you to know, of course, that Stokely gave Martin all sorts of headaches, and they did have deep disagreements. But in the book, Where Do We Go From Here? King spends a lot of words, and I mentioned this, Andrew, I think in our email exchange. King spends a lot of time articulating the things that he agrees with and respects and can understand in the Black Power perspective before leaning into why that perspective is wrong. But he did not wish to draw a hard partisan line between himself and Stokely Carmichael, except insofar as he had to make clear how it was that ultimately the nonviolent approach was superior to the approach of the Black Power movement, both tactically and morally. But he did that while making clear that he regarded Stokely Carmichael ultimately as a brother, and that he was looking to uplift the humanity and the valid concerns and grievances of the Black Power movement. I think we could take that approach, and I try to model my approach in this way towards today's modern social justice movement, understanding the fact that that is a damn high bar and a damn hard thing to do, because we will be punished by many of these folks regardless of how kind we try to be or how generous we try to be. But that is the very calling of nonviolence itself. That itself is the substance of King's legacy. And while it's hard to imagine any conventional definition of King that would make him a political conservative in any sense. I mean, you know, King's economic platform was frankly to the left of Bernie Sanders by the time he died. There is something that Kenny said that I think is worth picking out, which is the fact that, you know, King, one, he did believe in fallen human nature. That's absolutely true. And he was seeking ultimately to build towards something in the beloved community that is like sort of the kingdom of God, if you will, sort of the coming together of the human family, God's children, in a spirit of grace and love for one another. And King did speak to the generation, and I think this would have included Harry Boyte, the generation of white and black activists in the nonviolent movement, who, unlike the hippie generation, who, unlike the radicals of the time, unlike most American youth in the 60s in King's estimation, were preserving the commitment to a mutually dignifying human center of American discourse and activism, which pre-existed that movement, which sprouted up in opposition to McCarthyism in the 50s, but that represented the great hope for the future. This birthing of nonviolent, love-based organizing and democratic inclusion that could bring people together from across all of these lines. King saw that generation, Harry Boyte's generation of activists, as conserving that. And he used, one of the only times I've ever read King use the term conservative or conserving as an active descriptor of what he was trying to do. King was much more likely to use the term liberal or progressive in terms of describing, the aims of some of their organizing activities and his activities. But King did see the movement as conservative in that sense, conserving the moral capacity of American society and world society to bring people into a power-sharing democracy in which we are modeling the higher levels of the higher virtues of the human spirit, of love and goodwill. And that absolutely emanated from the Gospels and King's religious foundations, but is something that was accessible to anybody, secular or religious, I think, who sees the power of goodwill to transform relationships and society. So King was seeking to conserve that and to build upon it. And that's what I hope that all of us can do as well.
Thank you, John. I know we were going a little over time, but like you said, it's really hard to put this conversation in such a short time frame. So we're going to go for another 15 minutes. There's a really important question. And actually, John, you're going to appreciate this. It comes from my blue counterpart in the Braver Angels, Central Texas, Michael Say. And Mike asks, I'm interested to hear the panelists contrast the goal of colorblindness with racial inequity that exists today. If our society became colorblind, do you believe these inequities would disappear? Does someone want to take that question first?
I mean, I'll take the question first. Colorblindness does not mean everybody is going to be equitably in every position in every industry. Even in a completely colorblind society, say there was zero discrimination. If there was zero discrimination, some people would still make different choices that would result in different inequities, right? If somebody chooses to academically succeed and everything was entirely meritocratic, there will still be some racial groups that are more disproportionately represented than other racial groups, depending not on discrimination, but depending solely on cultural values. Hopefully that answers that question. I wanted to just briefly circle back to the notion of Martin Luther King and what he stood for. So first of all, temperamentally, I'm a dissenter. So forgive me if sometimes my dissent goes into places where it shouldn't. But when we say that we're standing for something, we are also standing against something. You have to understand that we are standing against something. And there were, during the civil rights movement, different visions of what you should stand for that were mutually exclusive to each other, that could all be part of the civil rights movement. There was Martin Luther King's vision of white and black children holding and integrating. In part, that's what drove Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon to create integration, to create forced busing policies, for example, in education. There were other visions during the time by people like Malcolm X, who said the black man and the white man can never live in peace and harmony together, and that the only solution was full racial separation. That is a legitimate consideration. That is a legitimate idea. But you need to understand that they are mutually exclusive. You cannot believe ultimately in a vision of integration without rejecting full separatism. And I hate to say it, but actually I don't hate to say it. It's important to recognize it. There were things that Malcolm X said that were correct. He talked about the white liberal. Malcolm X talked about the white liberal and how the white liberal says all of these great things about diversity and how charming and tolerant they are, while putting down the black man, in his actions. I mean, and today, we worship at the altar of diversity and inclusion in so many cases, which is a white progressive endeavor that elevates certain elite people who happen to be black, but really denigrates the entire community and insults them ultimately. So in that sense, I agree with Malcolm X. But ultimately, I do have to reject Malcolm X's statement and Malcolm X's vision that the races fundamentally have to be separated from each other. If we truly buy into what Martin Luther King is saying, we have to buy into an ideal, a still yet unachieved ideal, but an ideal that the white man and the black man can live together, can integrate, can understand each other fundamentally because we're all children of God. That is where Martin Luther King gets this basis for the idea that the black man and the white man can live together, even though the black man has had radically different experiences in some cases. We are still the same children of God. So
there's some other dimensions I have to get in here.
Yeah, please get in here. Let's do it.
It was not an ideal. It was a reality. Martin Luther King in his last sermon before he was killed talked about the prison guards, the white prison guards, as having similar interests. In 1964, after the March on Washington the year before, he assigned me to organize poor whites because he thought they had interests that could be tapped. And it turned out that was true. In Durham, North Carolina, I organized in a mill community which the white left at Duke thought was irredeemably racist. And actually, they developed a lot more relationships with the black community nearby than the white radicals at Duke. Dorothy Cotton, who was head of the Dorchester Center, where the Citizenship School's leadership was trained, invited a group of segregationists from Appalachia to come and interact, and then hired an organizer at the Dorchester Center to recruit poor whites from Appalachia to be involved. Now, that was certainly informed by a moral vision of human dignity and equality. It was also practical political calculation and strategy. That was not only King, it was Bayard Rustin, it was A. Philip Randolph, it was Vernon Jordan, it was there was a whole leadership of the movement which thought that the next stage, and this was a tragedy that didn't happen after the end of segregation, the next stage should be an interracial movement of working people. And also the color blindness is a tricky concept. King was a deep fan, appreciative of Alain Locke, who was the architect of the Harlem Renaissance, which was about the brilliance of the black tradition. And in that sense, King was like Jane Addams and others who thought every single tradition in America, cultural tradition, had a genius that needed to be brought out. By the way, that it was not an individualist meritocratic vision. It was very informed by the Scandinavian folk schools, which first inspired Highlander and then fed into all of the citizenship schools. So there's much more complexity and multidimensionality than what is often thought of as the liberal meritocratic individualist achievement ethic. It was really about a transformation, a vision of transformation. And by the way, the only other thing is that in that same talk where I had in the hot summer day in St. Augustine after I had talked my way out of getting lynched by the Klan. That's why I thought if I could do that, I could organize poor whites. He told me he was a populist. Not in the sense of the crazy misuse of the word, but in the sense of the 1930s, which had seen working people across racial lines in the South begin to organize. I'll use a really crucial memories and histories for us to use today to build the kind of movement that we need to build. I agree with that, but it needs to be an interracial movement of people based on human dignity and a vision of deeper democracy and equality.
Well, I'm going to just briefly respond to that, just very briefly. And thank you for saying that. White people were also lynched during the civil rights movement. People who stood
was almost killed by the Nazi Party. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. You know, and there were, this ties in because I know color blindness is a complex concept. I know it can inspire some hostility in people. But the reason why I believe in the word color blindness, and I believe that all of us here need to say, yes, we believe in color blindness, is not because I don't see African American culture contributing so much. It is because I see African American culture contributing so much, and Asian Chinese American culture contributing so much, and Mexican American culture contributing so much to the melting pot that is America, that I don't want people to distance that from what the American experiment really is about. That is America. That is who we are. That is not only who we can be, but as Harry said, that is who we are. We are people who value each other for what they can bring to the table, not for what they are by background. That's what color blindness really is about. Truly seeing people for what they can bring to the table, for their character, their merit, what they can give you, their value, whatever you want to call it, but not on the basis of the color of their skin.
So as they say, let's leave them wanting more. And I hope we can undertake another panel discussion like this, hopefully in a few months, perhaps on a slightly different topic, but related topic, as we try to come together as a movement and think through collectively and individually how we're going to try to move the country in a more liberal direction and classically liberal direction. Thank you so much to you all. Thank you, Erec and Free Black Thought. Thank you, John Wood Jr. and Braver Angel. Thank you on behalf of the Institute for Liberal Values. And thanks to all our panelists for a spirited discussion today. And look forward to more in the days ahead. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.